Today I'm going to take a look at the Amazon full-length Rings of Power trailer that finally has come out, that we finally get a little bit more semblance of a plot, minuscule as though it is, a little bit more. But instead of doing a full-length shot-by-shot analysis, there are plenty of YouTubers who do a great job at that, and we're going to find out pretty soon anyway what everything's about. It's all going to be shown to us. I want to take a look at one particular shot that I think encapsulates everything that Amazon is doing with the Rings of Power. However, before we do that, if you like what you're seeing, if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe, please like, please share. We want the world to know that there are Tolkien fans who love Tolkien more than they hate Amazon. I mean, I don't think many of us really hate Amazon and what they're doing. It's just that we want it done in a way that is respectful of Tolkien and holds his words in high regard and high esteem. So like, subscribe, and we're going to keep analyzing and keep doing the things that show what Tolkien originally intended and what might be changed, along with our podcast Window on the West and things like that. So anyway, like, subscribe, share. We appreciate it. So let's take a look at this trailer. And like I said, I'm not going to review it shot by shot because there's plenty of other folks doing that. But what I do want to take a look at is the plot, one, which is really just Sauron's back. And Sauron's back. We don't know why or where or how, but we know that the men don't really believe that he's back, at least from the phrases that we see in the trailer.
Our days of peace begin.
What we do know is that the women are all in on understanding that he is there. These strong female warriors, they're getting together and they know what's up.
It is here, Galadriel, the moment we feared.
Evil does not sleep. It waits.
If the evil rising is left unchecked, it will take us all.
Together we can survive this!
So that's not exactly surprising, I think, if anyone's been following what Amazon's been doing with their recent properties, including Wheel of Time, for instance. So let's talk more about the changes that are becoming clearer that Amazon is making to Tolkien's works with every new trailer. And like I said before, I don't want you to think that I reflexively hate Amazon or that I reflexively dislike everything that they're going to do. In fact, Rings of Power, it might end up being a great show if it wasn't Tolkien. But they want the built-in fandom. They want the world that they've got, right? They can't make anything new on their own anyway. So they're just going to take what they have and shift things and move things around and make things more to the zeitgeist that they really want to adhere to. So I don't hate Amazon, right? I love Tolkien, though. I love his works. I love his world. I love the way that he wrote. I mean, his phraseology, his prose is beautiful, and people forget that. It's not just the history. It's not just the characters. It's not just the land that he created. It's his prose. That's why we love reading it, because he was able to say so much in so few words that spoke to our hearts, that spoke to our heads, that spoke to our souls. And that is why he is still esteemed as the greatest fantasy writer of all time. He created the genre, right? There was no fantasy genre before he came around with maps and dwarves and elves and orcs and all these sorts of things that are just sort of second-rate characters now in almost every fantasy saga that's come out. So I love Tolkien more than I hate Amazon. But in watching the trailers, I look for glimpses of things that perhaps say, oh, here's something that Tolkien wrote, that Tolkien created, that we are diving in on, that we are going to really display for the fans to see. And I ache for those in the trailer. And there are a few shots here and there that I really like. I specifically like the wide angle shots, the places where they're creating the world. I think that's a great thing to see, because sometimes it's hard to imagine the scope of things when you're reading Tolkien's books. So seeing the scope in a grand way, like when I first saw Khazad-dûm in Peter Jackson's trilogy with the huge columns going up to the roof of the cave, right? That impressed upon me how big Khazad-dûm actually was. And I appreciated his films for that. My concern with Amazon, though, isn't really the world that they portray. It's that they won't create a show that honors his original work, right? That always looks back to the text, that holds the same ideas and views that Tolkien had when he created Middle-earth, that respects him more, instead of any political leanings instead of what they believe is the current zeitgeist for how they're supposed to be creating things. And so they're allowing the show to be molded by, be sculpted by the winds of our time rather than the creations, the words of Tolkien. And again, I'm not angry. I'm not frothing at the mouth. I'm not calling anybody shills or anything like that. I want to make sure that every little bit of Tolkien's work, his original work, is preserved in new licensed pieces, right? When it comes to Amazon's Rings of Power, when it comes to, say, Lord of the Rings Online, even fan art, even fan stories, right? I want people to subcreate within his world and not within their own, right? You can't pretend that this is the character that I wanted to see because Tolkien didn't write it the way that I wanted to write it, right? You have to work within his world. And I know some of you probably disagree with that, but that's the way that I approach original works of fiction, is you have to play within their world. You can't create a brand new one out of what they created. If you want to do that, you might as well just go and create your own. So when it comes to this in the Rings of Power, right, I'm just more disappointed. I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed because it stuns me. It stuns me to think that they think they can write something better than Tolkien. They discard people like Tom Shippey, who is the world's leading scholar probably on Tolkien. And Tolkien spent his whole life creating the world. These Rings of Power writers, they've spent a couple of years, right? Tolkien knew his world inside and out. He knew what he was trying to inject into there. And sure, it changed, and stories and characters moved places occasionally. And he was still working it to practically the day he died, right? Up until a couple months he died was some of the last notes that we had in the Histories of Middle-earth and Unfinished Tales. So my problems aren't in anger. My problems are in disappointment, right? With what they're doing. And I think those problems can all be summed up in this one image, right? And this one image here of Miriel on the right, Tar Miriel, and Galadriel on the left. So this image shows us three things. Let me go over those three things. It shows us that it's changing the history. Two people who have never met in any of Tolkien's works, are now meeting. They've said that they're confidently suppressing the timeline from 1800 or so years, maybe even a little bit more, down to a couple years, a decade. I don't know. They haven't exactly said how far. And they're bringing together everything from the rise of Anatar, who is Sauron in disguise, to the downfall of Numenor nearly 2 entire centuries later. It's a hell of a thing to do. And there are so many stories in the 2,000 years that could be great. And obviously they're going to have to make major changes to this story. And you can see those major changes right in this picture here with Miriel and with Galadriel. So these major changes to this story, I think Tolkien already addressed in a letter to Rainer Unwin in, is it 1958? But this is what he said when he was presented with a script treatment for The Lord of the Rings. He wrote, "The present script is rather a compression with resultant overcrowding and confusion, blurring of climaxes, and general degradation." Right? And doesn't that speak directly to the Rings of Power and what it's doing? Like in this image right here, it's showing that we're compressing Tarmiriel and Galadriel and putting them right together when they would never have met otherwise. Galadriel was in a completely different place 1,800 years later. Tarmiriel, of course, was never the queen. We'll get to that in a second. But these things, right? It's compression. It's 1,800 years down to 5 seasons of a story, of one story that they've said we're just crushing it down. And then Tolkien mentions overcrowding. You're sticking people in places that they never were and having them do things that they never did. So you're compressing the timeline. You're compressing the people together when there was great separation between them. And he mentions the blurring of climaxes, right? There are major climaxes that took place in these 1,800 years, from wars ended to kings moving on. These climaxes, I mean, so much happens just in Numenor that to compress it down is a disappointment. And to add more climaxes or to make these other climaxes more meaningless is a major disappointment. And when you have all those three things together, Tolkien says, right, you have a general degradation. When you change the original story, you're degrading what it was meant to tell. You're telling something else. You're making things less meaningful. You're making characters less impactful. And you're generally disrespecting what the original author wrote. So Amazon had an opportunity to deliberately build a story with care, to really make us invest in those characters. I originally thought that the Rings of Power would truly be all about the forging of the Rings of Power, and how, despite Sauron's deception as Anatar, the giver of gifts, the elves crafted the 3 elven rings in secret, and they were able to resist and ultimately defeat Sauron after he pushed through to Eregion and was assaulting Rivendell. Right, all that sort of space is just, it's going to be completely minimized in a tale over 5 seasons, in a tale where so much could have happened in that time, right? Where I thought that this would end with them pushing Sauron back to Mordor, but we're not going to get that. Apparently, it's going to end with the failure of Numenor, because when you have Muriel in there, that's the only place it can go, because that is her fall. It doesn't make sense if you are going back to the text like they say they are. So again, in this picture, I look at it and I say, all right, you should have trusted Tolkien. You shouldn't have changed the characters, right? Galadriel was never the driving force for fighting Sauron. She recognized him and she had a part, but between Gil-galad and Elrond, it's clear that they were the driving force for Sauron. And Muriel, she was never even in contact with Galadriel. That shift of her not even being a queen ever, right? She was usurped as the heir to the throne by Ar-Pharazôn, by him forcibly marrying her, right? But Galadriel, she never came to Numenor. Tolkien never spoke of her coming to Numenor. He speaks of the Eldar coming to Numenor, so we do have that. But we don't have her coming to Numenor, and we certainly don't have her as a military commander, right? This here, like, they're meeting together. There's another shot in the trailer of them clasping hands to say, we're in this together, we're going to fight together. She was never a military commander. She was perhaps the first one to see through to who Anatar, Sauron, originally was, but she didn't ever lead armies against him. Tolkien makes that clear. It was Elrond, it was Gil-galad. They were at the forefront. And Muriel, she was never the queen of Numenor, right? Her rightful place, this is not her role that we see in this picture. Her rightful place as heir to the throne was denied when Pharazôn forced her to marry him and he took the crown. She was never queen. And Tolkien wrote this storyline already, but Amazon decided that they knew better. And that brings me to my third point. So number 1 was it's changing the history, right? People who never met are now meeting. And number 2 was they're changing the characters. Galadriel was never the force for fighting Sauron. Muriel was never the queen regent. And we see them meeting here, right? They changed their relationship. They changed their motivations. They changed who they are. And number 3, and perhaps this encapsulates why they're making the changes that they feel they need to make. Amazon is actively changing Tolkien's work to reflect the worldview that they want to create rather than what Tolkien created, right? They believe that their worldview is actually better than Tolkien's. And Tolkien's worldview was of Middle-earth, right? It was influenced by who he was, but it wasn't like he was trying to inject his politics into Middle-earth. He was writing what he knew, and what he knew was based on him going to World War I and him marrying Edith, right? His worldview wasn't to be a political activator. It wasn't to be someone who influenced the times, right? He wrote Middle-earth out of the love of writing Middle-earth and out of the love of the mythology and out of the love of the language. So then this is what Amazon does, right? They take the characters that Tolkien wrote. They take Muriel and they take Galadriel, and they take a Galadriel who was the most powerful elf outside of Feanor. And we're talking power that isn't a sword, that isn't an axe, that isn't a bow, right? They take her and they make her a military leader. But Tolkien never explicitly wrote that she carried armies into battle. That was Gil-galad and Elrond. She was the leader of her people, and she had insight into the enemy that many others didn't. So for instance, in Unfinished Tales, Tolkien wrote this. In her wisdom, Galadriel saw that Lorien would be a stronghold and point of power to prevent the Shadow, Sauron, from crossing the Anduin in the war that must inevitably come before it was again defeated. if that were possible, but that it needed a rule of greater strength and wisdom than the Sylvan folk possessed, right? Her power was in the wisdom, was in the perception, and was also in the lore, which made her, for lack of a better term, magical. She had this kind of power. Tolkien makes clear that her power was never in a sword or a dagger or a bow. He noted that she was, aside from Fëanor, the greatest elf in lore, the greatest elf in beauty. I mean, her hair captured the light of Telperion and Laurelin, the original two trees. That was one of the ways that Tolkien described her. She studied under Melian the Maya, who had married Thingol of Doriath, right? Her power was in her ability to perceive others, in the secret and still mysterious lore of the Noldor that gave her strength to preserve, to fight against magics that were beyond what normal men and dwarves and most other elves actually had, right? And then she ended up getting the Ring Nenya in order to withstand Sauron even better. And so she was strong, incredibly strong, but it was never in swinging a sword or loosing an arrow or fighting the orcs or leading an army. There is nothing that says she was a military commander in what Tolkien wrote. She was a leader, but being a military commander is a completely separate thing. And to argue this from silence that, oh, well, Tolkien never wrote it, so we can go ahead and do it, it doesn't fly, right? That's not an argument you can make that anybody's going to buy in the long run. You have to go with what Tolkien wrote, and Tolkien did not write her as a commander. He wrote her as a powerful, magical being of lore who was second only to Fëanor, the entire instigator in the Silmarillion, in the histories of the downfall of Middle-earth. So, Galadriel, that's how Amazon's changing that with the winds of this culture. And now with Miriel, we see the same thing, right? She's taking on a role that she never had with Tolkien's work. She's the official ruler of Númenor in the Rings of Power. But in Unfinished Tales, Tolkien wrote that when her father died, Ar-Pharazôn forced her to marry him, and he took the crown. She would have been the queen, absolutely, but that wasn't good enough for Amazon. She couldn't be the powerful behind-the-scenes one trying to take Ar-Pharazôn down. She had to be shown as the queen to begin with, right? They could have made her a powerful woman who doesn't bow to his pressures, who works behind the scenes with the faithful in order to save Númenor. And in the end, she goes down with the ship, so to speak, and has done everything she could. And she was powerful enough. She used her strength in order to make sure that she was fighting behind the scenes behind Ar-Pharazôn. But they had to make her the queen regent. They had to make her the ruler already. They had to put her in battle because that's the only way that they know what a strong woman is. That's disappointing. Because it's just not good writing, and you're not hewing to what Tolkien actually wrote. So she can't be a strong woman unless she's a queen, is the way that they're looking at it. And a Galadriel can't be a strong woman unless she's a warrior leading the cavalry charge. I'm disappointed. I mean, you know, you can bet they read what Tolkien wrote, and they probably immediately knew that they thought it was better the way they wrote it. Because they could show the queen of Númenor, and they could show Galadriel, the most powerful elf, working together in a great singularity of girl power that they had to have based on Amazon's own projections of what the world should have looked like. So I'm disappointed. Because what Tolkien set out for them was already great. It was already strong with characters, male and female. They didn't need to make these changes, but they continue to be led by showrunners and writers who are more beholden to their politics and their worldview than to what Tolkien wrote. And that's sad. And Tolkien saw that in the early treatment of the film version of The Lord of the Rings, right? Where he wrote in 1958, "The canons of narrative art in any medium cannot be wholly different, and the failure of poor films is often precisely in exaggeration and in the intrusion of unwarranted matter owing to not perceiving where the core of the original lies." Let me read that again. "The canons of narrative art in any medium, cannot be wholly different, and the failure of poor films is often precisely in exaggeration and in the intrusion of unwarranted matter owing to not perceiving where the core of the original of what Tolkien lies." I couldn't have said it any better. And I wish Amazon had thought the same. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you like it, hit subscribe, hit share, hit like, and we'll see you next time.